Good morning or afternoon, everybody. TGIFF, welcome to FSMA Fridays. And our topic this month, sanitary transport of human and animal food. I'm Barbara Levin. I'll be your host today. Before we begin, let me give you a couple of housekeeping announcements. We are on WebEx today, whether you have logged in to see the visuals or just calling in. If you have any technical problems, whether you're on audio only or on both, you can call 877-509-3239. For those of you not looking at the screen, 877-509-3239. A copy of the recording will be available by end of day Monday. Due to our technology, you'll be able to submit questions online only. For those of you who call in every month, I do encourage you to email me at blevin@safetychain.com if you've got any questions you'd like to submit in advance. But with that, we'd like to jump right in and introduce our speakers. With our FSMA Friday team today, we've got Jennifer McIntyre, who is the VP and Chief Science Officer of the Atchison Group, and Melanie Newman, who's the VP and CFO, both frequent guests with us. David's on a plane right now, so Jennifer and Melanie, welcome, and very excited to have you with us. And we are going to jump right in. As everybody knows, before we get into our topic of the day, we like to start with just what's the latest and greatest coming from FDA. And Melanie, I'm going to ask you to do this for us today. So welcome and tell us what's going on.
Thanks, Barbara, and good to be back to FSMA Friday. And I am, for one, happy it is Friday, so TGIFF, everyone on the line. Barbara, a lot of moving parts in FSMA. There's been a lot of industry requests for more time to comment on these proposed rules. All 7 of them are out, and FDA has responded. So, for example, FDA announced a 90-day extension of the comment period for the food defense rule and also the accompanying draft qualitative risk assessment as well. So those comment periods are now June 30th of this year. So we now are taking a look at different extensions of proposed rules, and all the rules are looking at new final rule deadlines ranging from August 2015 to March 2016. We understand that might seem like a lot of time to you all, but boy, there's a lot in these rules to have to comply with that can sneak up on us. We have a list of all of the new deadlines posted on our website at www.atchisongroup.com under our FSMA icon, and we just invite everyone to take a look and take a peek at those new rules posted on there.
And that's a great resource. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because these are, as you said, just a lot of moving parts, and the dates keep changing. So that's a great place to be able to go to see the latest. Melanie, I'm going to stay with you for just a moment here as we move on to our topic, which is the sanitary transport of human and animal food. Can you do a few things for us? Can you provide, at a high level, kind of an overview of the rule? And you and Jennifer and I were speaking before we started today. Everybody kind of thinks this 7th pillar here is a little bit of a sleeper, but actually it's probably one that everybody should be paying attention to. And maybe you can talk us through some of that.
That's a great way to put it, Barbara, and certainly happy to address that. Some of you might not know, but this rule's been in the making for over 20 years. So it has been sleeping, and it has been a sleeper, and it's been in and out of focus and attention throughout time. But now it's kind of a sleeping giant, and the giant's woken up, and that dragon, if you will, if you're a moviegoer within The Hobbit, the dragon has awakened. And that dragon's really hitting and impacting every aspect of the supply chain. And while the main focus of this rule really is on proper temperature controls and separation of food from non-food, so we make sure that we're avoiding cross-contamination, its impact is broader than that, and it's deeper than that, and especially in as much as it's much more broad and deep than the other 6 rules under FSMA that have come out so far. And let me just give you an example. The Sanitary Transport rule, it's not just limited to FDA-registered facilities under the Bioterrorism Act. It's also applying to businesses that are regulated not only by FDA, but also by USDA. And another big surprise, Barbara, is that the rule would apply to carriers who transport food whether or not this food is offered across state lines. So normally we see these rules applying to quote-unquote interstate commerce, where products have to go across state lines before these federal regulations are triggered. But this rule applies to in-state shipments of food products. So this is a very different ballgame now. And lastly, just to highlight another reason why this rule is now a giant, is that receivers have some heightened duties. Even now retailers, food service players, for example. Now there are some exemptions, which Jennifer will cover in the next section. So there are some areas that people don't have to necessarily comply with this rule, but this really has awakened the giant, and finally after 20, 25 years, this rule has come to light, and it is shaken up the industry, and especially the transportation industry, more so than I think anyone had really anticipated. So industry really should be paying attention to your point.
Well, then let's move on to Jennifer. Jennifer, welcome. Great to have you back to FSMA Friday. And,
Thank you.
Maybe let's start with, okay, who does this apply to? Because as Mel said, it's not just FDA-regulated companies. So who's going to be covered and who's going to be exempt?
Yeah, relative to many of the other rules, there are relatively few exemptions here. So the coverage is quite broad. This rule covers food both for humans and for animals. It's on the FDA-regulated side as well as the USDA-regulated side. It's between states, that interstate commerce, as well as the intrastate commerce, as Melanie said. So it's quite comprehensive in that regard. There are a couple of exemptions, and the issue here, the focus here is really on bulk foods where you could have those issues with cross-contamination, as well as foods that do require temperature control. So there is an exemption for foods that are fully packaged and shelf-stable. So if a truck is carrying only packaged food, shelf-stable packaged foods solely, there would be an exemption for that. If it's boxes that have holes cut out of it, that's not considered fully packaged. That would be covered under this rule. There's also a dollar exemption. I think that it's $500,000 in annual sales where there's an exemption, as well as foods that are just being transshipped. So foods that are not ultimately going to be consumed in the United States, but maybe where the U.S. is just a pass-through, that also is exempt. But for the most part, I think that we can look at this rule and see the breadth of coverage and that it is much greater with many fewer exemptions than many of the other FSMA rules.
So still a lot of companies. Let's go on to the impact of this rule and look at the various industry sectors for transportation. Mel, why don't I start with you and maybe, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm doing that. Jennifer, I'm going to stay with you to maybe talk about the impact on shippers and carriers. And Melanie, I'm going to come back to you for receivers. But maybe you can tell us, how is this going to impact these companies?
Sure. And, when you're looking at shippers, carriers, and receivers, and think about the coverage of this rule, who this rule applies to, you can see that this rule will touch just about everybody because most people are shippers or receivers, and if they're not, they're in between and they're carriers, the people actually, hauling the product. In terms of what they need to do, the shippers they know their food, they know what they're shipping, and they need to communicate, they need to specify the conditions for this food. If it needs temperature control, what is that temperature control? What are cross-contamination issues? They need to have, if the food is exposed, they need to have hand washing facilities available for the loading and then on the receiving and the unloading of these food products. So the shippers bear a good deal of responsibility here, even though they're the ones who aren't actually transporting the product. But it is their product, and so they need to communicate heavily with the carriers to make sure that the food is transported safely. And then the carriers are the ones who need to actually execute. So they need to make sure that the equipment that they're using is appropriate for hauling food, that it is clean, that they've got written procedures for the cleaning and sanitation of the vehicles, rail or motor vehicles that they're using. Like other aspects of FSMA, this rule is heavy on documentation, showing that you've thought these things through, you've put the processes down in place, and that these processes are being executed upon. The carriers need to communicate to the shippers of bulk products' previous hauls and the cleaning interventions that have occurred, again, as Melanie said, to make sure that there aren't these cross-contamination opportunities available. And there's a fair amount of training that needs to be done for the shippers also, so that for the carriers, I'm sorry, so that it's clear what the expectation is and how to handle that expectation, how to manage it.
Okay, it's a lot. It is really very, very comprehensive and a lot of impact there. So what about on the receiving end? Because as Jennifer said, Melanie, just about everybody's going to be impacted by this rule. So if I'm receiving product, what do I have to do? What's the impact on me going to be?
That's a great question, and Jennifer did a great job really trying to communicate that breadth and the depth of the impact and the scope of it really does impact just about everyone, and how critical documentation becomes, and the breadth and the swath of this rule. And you said it and summed it up well yourself, Barbara, in that, wow, that's a lot, and it is a lot. And it really hits home on the receivers who historically haven't really had a lot of obligation, responsibility, or duty in this part of the food chain process, if you will. They usually have been able to just open up their dock door, receive products, and if they did much of anything by way of receiving protocols, they did it for their own brand protection and their own corporate best practices and things of that nature, and that's very good, but now they have a regulatory obligation and duty to do certain things. So the impact to receivers in this rule is kind of a corollary part. So just much like a shipper, receivers also have to have hand washing facilities that are convenient with running water for those people handling the food products to have access to. And also, understand the impact of this rule. It applies to any receivers, anyone who is receiving food after transportation. That can be a little mom and pop convenience store who is opening up and receiving food products that are requiring this time temperature controls that are exposed products. So we've got a huge training issue on our hands. Back to Jennifer's point that there's a lot of training obligations and needs under this rule as well, and a lot of documentation, which we'll get to here again in a moment. But retailers, food service, small convenience stores who handle this type of food subject to this rule now have to actively participate and be subject to more regulatory oversight under FDA and FSMA than ever before.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, let's go on to waivers then, because there has been talk of waivers. Melanie, what is a waiver in the context of this rule, and who might be eligible for a waiver?
Sure. There's certainly opportunities to receive a waiver to allow yourself to be waived from this rule. And a waiver in its primary goal and its essence truly is to show that the safety of the food is not compromised, so that you can waive out of it. Ultimately, those who would qualify for a waiver are those that transport grade A dairy under the pasteurized milk ordinance, and those food establishments that hold otherwise valid permits under local or state ordinances or other regimes. So really primarily here we're looking at those who would qualify for waivers as those who can prove that they are under other sorts of practices, protocols, or ordinances that would show that they're not compromising the safety of the food.
Okay. Jennifer, you know, we've spoken a lot about good manufacturing practices throughout these topics, and, you know, given that there's been 25 years or 20 years of looking at transportation, will this rule fill in gaps for transportation when it comes to GMPs?
Yeah, and FDA is pretty clear about that, and they even laid out a nice little table kind of showing how this rule and some of the elements of this rule relate to what is already in place and has been in place for many decades in food manufacturing facilities in the way of good manufacturing practices. So there have always been requirements on the books that manufacturers maintain sanitation, that they have good hygiene, that they're monitoring temperature, that they have you know, those devices and that they're actually watching them. And so what this rule does is just kind of mirrors some of those GMP elements that are applicable to the transportation community. And many of these FDA acknowledges are already industry best practice, if not industry standard practice. So I think that's part of the reason that people perceive this to be a little bit of a snooze, is because by and large within the transportation community, many of these things are already in place. I'm not sure that the documentation is always, you know, has always been handled in a way that you're prepared for a regulator to inspect the documents. But the rule with respect to GMPs, it just kind of fills in those gaps, from a regulatory perspective, the gaps that were there in the transportation industry, and aligns it with what's happening in the rest of the food industry.
Okay, that makes sense. Before we open up to questions, you know, as we have been saying, that this seventh pillar has the potential to have a huge impact. Melanie, before we get into questions, what are some of the things that, you know, the folks that have joined us today should take away from this in terms of, you know, what do we have to do? What should we start to prepare for?
Sure, great question, and it's really where does the rubber meet the road, and Jennifer hit on something very salient. It's, you know, a lot of the industry is probably already doing in practice a lot of these good practices and have a lot of these protocols in place, but you need to be really focusing on documentation, developing your written record-keeping procedures, and training your people, and really focusing on the training requirements under this rule, and focusing and implementing those specific training elements. And developing procedures for communicating records to your shippers, carriers, and receivers per the rules and the elements under this rule. And, you know, to the extent that you're not, really focusing and ensuring that your temperature controls and the sanitation of your trucks and the inspection procedures and protocols of your trucks are matching and up to snuff with the requirements of this rule. And so take a look at what your inspection protocols are with respect to your truck inspections and things of that nature. And take a look at it now and not a month before this rule becomes effective. That's not the time to do it. The time to do it is now, to get prepared. And ultimately, you know you're probably doing all of the right things. But I've said it before and I'll say it again, in the eyes of the regulators and the agencies, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Documentation is super critical now. And it's easy for an inspector to come in and say, show me your SOPs, show me the documentation, and to nail you for it if you don't have it. So it's very, you know, it's easy for you to sit down and make sure that you don't get dinged in an inspection based upon lack of documentation. Why give them that ammunition? Let's get prepared now for it.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, these are things that most companies are doing, and if not, should be doing anyhow. Well, let's go out of full screen here and get ready for some questions from the audience. Excuse me. So everybody now, you should be able to see the Q&A tab on the lower right-hand side, and you can enter your questions there and hit send. And let me just give everybody a little bit of information while we're waiting for that. If you are already registered, obviously you are because you're here, you don't have to re-register for some of these upcoming topics. I'm very excited about our April topic on what constitutes a good FDA audit. We're going to be talking about traceability in May and FDA access to your records. I think we're going to have a very big crowd for that one in June, and we're going to also be announcing a couple extra months of topics that we're working on right now. Anybody in your company that isn't registered, they can always register for free as always at FSMAFridays.com. We've got some great webinars coming up that you can register for free at SafetyChain.com. On May 9th, we're going to be talking about developing an optimized operational food performance culture with Jeff Chilton, who's president of Chilton Consulting Group, Bob Savage, president of HACCP Consulting Group, 35-year career with FDA and USDA, is going to be talking about creating HACCP excellence best practices from an industry insider on May 16th. If you will be in Chicago at Pet Food Forum next week or in Baltimore the following week at Food Safety Summit, come visit SafetyChain. We'd love to see you. And both of the websites, AtchisonGroup.com and SafetyChain.com, are also here if you'd like more information on how SafetyChain can help you automate many of your FSMA and other food safety requirements, and how Atchison Group can get you ready with your programs. So let's get to some questions. Got a question from James, who is asking, what about LTL package shipments where products are mixed? What about shipments where products are cross-docked? Who wants to handle? Melanie, you want to take that one?
Jennifer. This is Jennifer, and I can take a stab at that one. Packaged, it depends if they're fully packaged or not, and if they need temperature control or not in terms of coverage. FDA had the authority, Congress gave FDA the authority in this rule to prohibit the co-shipment of food and non-food products and specify those non-food products that would not be allowed to be shipped with food. FDA said that they couldn't come up with any non-food products that in every circumstance wouldn't be able to be shipped with food. So there is no prohibition per se on mixing products, other than, again, ensuring, particularly when you have packaged products, that the integrity is maintained and that this food wouldn't become contaminated. And so in terms of whether it's LTL or not, I don't think that FDA really makes a distinction. It's whether it's fully packaged or not, whether temperature control is required or not. In terms of cross-docking, that kind of gets at who's the shipper and who's the receiver, and particularly where temperature control is maintained, there is a need to maintain temperature control and to keep those records regardless of where the product is.
Okay. Melanie, Sarah's asking, we're a direct marketing mail order company. Our fruit shipments require vent holes to maintain quality. How would we enforce this rule to the U.S. Postal Service and FedEx, where a package would go through a shipping hub or multiple truck transfers?
You know, that's a great question, and I'll ask Jennifer to weigh in after I respond, but certainly in that scenario, you would be a shipper, and you'd have your duties as a shipper under this rule to be able to dictate and to specify what your shipping requirements are. In that case, you don't have a fully packaged product that doesn't require temperature control. You'd have temperature control requirements, and you've got an exposed product. So you'd have to set forth what your temperature control requirements are to your shipper or to your carrier, and your carrier in that case would be FedEx or the U.S. Postal Service, and you need to let them know what that is, and they would, they would be the carrier in that instance who would need to abide by those. I don't know, Jennifer, if you've got anything to add to that.
I'm trying to think, and I don't remember in reading the preamble to the rule, if FDA calls out those types of shipments, the UPS, FedEx, as a special case. I
didn't recall seeing that in the rule either, as an exemption or a special case.
But it's important to note that the comment period on this rule is open. So these are the types, some of the types of issues that I think if you see the need for FDA to address these separately, these are the things that you can call out in comments back to the agency or request clarification from the agency about some of these different types of circumstances that FDA just may not have considered.
Okay. And I think we're going to probably be talking about this a lot more coming up. I'm going to start with you on this question, Melanie, because you answered the question about waivers, but Jennifer, please go in. Paul is asking if you can give a couple of examples of those who qualify for waivers, specifically those companies that might already be under a local ordinance.
Sure. Certainly those, again, who are under, if they're transporting grade A dairy milk and milk products under the pasteurized milk ordinance, they would qualify. Those who are otherwise operating under, that are sending their food establishments that might be holding valid permits and are operators that are selling their products direct to consumers after transportation from the establishment. So basically where I'm going with this is restaurant takeout, caterers, home grocery delivery operators. Those would be some other arenas where waivers would come into play there.
Okay. Jeff is asking, Jennifer, how does this rule apply to product that needs further processing?
It certainly can apply to product that needs further processing. Again, the coverage is quite broad here. So there is a main area, I guess, a main type of food product that is clearly covered under this rule are products that are transported in bulk, which may very well wind up being further processed. Again, sanitation, cleanliness, and lack of cross-contamination is key. Temperature control, if required, is key. So just because a product will be further processed doesn't mean that you can use insanitary transportation practices during the transport of this product.
We're almost to the bottom of the hour. We haven't even come close to getting through a lot of these questions. How's your time, Jennifer and Melanie? Do you have another 10 or 15 minutes?
I do.
Okay, great. Probably should have asked you that before. I know that Jennifer's just off of a plane from Fiji, hasn't had any sleep, so what's another 15 minutes, right? Paul is asking, can you explain how this rule affects international suppliers? For example, does a company in the Philippines that exports bananas to the U.S., are they required to have documentation from the farm to the ship? Melanie?
Well, this will apply. This rule will definitely apply to anybody who transports products even from outside the U.S. in a freight container via ship or air. That you move it via road or rail in the U.S. for U.S. consumption. So if that is coming from outside the U.S., that's still fair game under this rule.
It is fair game. I don't think the documentation necessarily has to go all the way back to the farm if it's been a complex supply chain, but it's the person who, it's kind of the one back.
The one back.
The person
it's still the bioterrorism act mapping of the documentation. Yep.
Who's actually put that product on the ship in the container, as long as it's in a container that's going to be moved intact once stateside, that's where the responsibility lies.
Okay. It is the bottom of the hour. For those of you that do have to leave us, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We will see you hopefully next month on what constitutes a good audit. You'll get your recording on Monday, and you can listen to the rest of the Q&A, but we've got a lot. So for the rest of you, thanks for sticking with us, and we're going to keep going down this list of questions. Larry is asking, will this rule affect trucks delivering animal feed from feed mills to dairy farms? Melanie?
Yeah, the exemptions do address a bit with respect to animals, but the exemptions only apply to carrying live animals and raw agricultural products from a farm. Other than that, this rule does apply to both human and animal food and feed.
Okay. Jennifer, Ron is asking, what if I move bulk peanuts from one bin to another bin at my location? Love this question. Would that truck movement fall under this regulation? So not just interstate, but interlocation.
My gut tells me no, that may not be a logical application of the rule, but according to the letter of the law, I'm not sure, and I would want to check with Melanie on that. I know that within a corporate umbrella, moving from one location to another is covered. They're different facilities, they're registered differently. That is covered, but within a, on one physical premises, moving product, that doesn't seem reasonable to me. But I don't know if it's clearly spelled out. And Mel, do you have any insight on that?
I'm right there with you, Jennifer. I don't know. That is a very good question, and I don't know that that rule really adequately answers that question. And again, I go back to Jennifer's great mention before, which is the rule still open for comment. And if we don't think that that rule adequately answers and addresses that concern, we should definitely, as an industry, be filing comments to say that it needs to, because that's certainly an area which I would think would be a very impractical application of the rule, should not apply, and we as an industry should say so.
Melanie, there's a question from Steve. It's actually a little further down, but I'm going to just jump to it really quickly because he's asking, what is the most effective way to comment? So, I mean, should individual companies file comments? Are they best to go through, an association like LGMA? What's the best way to have your comments heard?
That's a great question, and I'm a big advocate of both. I think there's power in numbers if the trade association is aligning with the best interests of your company. And sometimes your trade association is speaking in the same voice that protects your interests and is vocalizing your same concerns with respect to the rule. And sometimes they're not. Maybe they're just swerving a little bit off into left field that maybe as one voice, that trade association isn't necessarily espousing all of your interests or your concerns with respect to that rule. And you will also want to file your own company-sponsored comments. I will also say that the more comments that FDA gets on the same topic, the more they, quote, hear you as an industry. And so if they get 27 comments on one issue or one subdivision or one topic, they're more likely to act than if they get one. So if we as an industry, in each individual company simply only rely on the voice of our trade associations to carry our voice on these comments, FDA is only going to get the comments filed by the trade associations, and we're not going to get the power of the numbers behind those voices and behind those comments. Whereas if companies individually also file comments on particular concerns within the rules, that power of numbers and that aggregate voice starts to become better heard, and the chances of FDA actually making change to those rules, whichever rule we're talking about in the 7 pillars of FSMA right now, whether it be the Sanitary Transport rule or any of the other 6 that are out there, you're much more apt to create and influence change by doing that. But again, I go back to ask yourself and ask the trade group, you know, are they speaking with the same one voice that you need them to do to carry the torch of the concerns of your company? If they are, you can go on their bandwagon. If they're not, file your own comments. Doing so is very easy. You can go to the FDA website. There is a way to be able to file your comments electronically very, very easily through an electronic submission process to do so that way.
Good, thank you. Well put. It's something we don't get very often. I love it. A question for me from Diane. Is there an application of SafetyChain for this rule? Yes. With SafetyChain, you know, for those of you who are familiar with what we do, you know, it's think about the supply chain. Well, we're the safety chain along that supply chain and helping enforce safety and quality at all points along the chain. So, you know, if you think about food safety is, you know, say what you do what you say, make sure it works, and make sure it's documented. It applies to this as any other rule. Inspections, all of the requirements can be defined in the system. All of the GMPs, schedules, whatever you've got there. Auto notifications would go out. Alerts would go out in real time if there's a nonconformance, so you can get a timely CAPA. But everything is documented. We even partner with a company that can put temperature probes in trucks, and so that if something's reaching a critical limit, an alert can go out. It's cloud-based, so everybody can get the information they need to get before they ship, before they receive, during transport. Probably a lot, and for those of you that are interested in that, when you get the follow-up email on Monday that has the recording, you'll have an opportunity to ask to be contacted for more information on how the technology can help. So thank you for asking that. Let's see, I'm going here. Tiffany is asking, what was the name of the website that has the FSMA updates and summaries? That's the Atchison Group website on the FSMA tab, and you can see their URL right there. It's atchisongroup.com. Marina is asking, would a letter to the trucking companies and customers who own their own trucks explaining the requirements to ship products be sufficient? Do we need to get copies of truck cleaning when they arrive to proof, I'm assuming proof of cleaning, when they arrive to pick up our product? Jennifer, I'm going to start with you on that. If you scroll down through all these questions, you might, there's a lot of words there, maybe you can see it. So would a letter to the companies who use their own trucks explaining the requirements be sufficient to prove that you've complied with this law?
As the shipper, it could be sufficient depending on the level of detail and the information that's contained in that letter. You need to have a communication to the shipper, to the carrier from the shipper to explain what the requirement is. In terms of the information that you're getting back, so you need to convey to them what they need to do. They need to convey to you that they actually did it and the procedures that were used, that they have documented procedures. And this is part of what, just for the good of your company and your brand, you might want to consider evaluating those procedures and making sure that they're in sync with what your expectation is. And I'm not, in my screen, I am not seeing that question. So was there a part of it that I missed?
No, I think you did get most of it there. Melanie, Paul is asking, when you say this rule is heavy on documentation, does that simply mean as long as you have a current SSOP, SOP, and GMP that you have met the new documentation requirement, or is there more to it?
You know, I'd say there's more to it, but as long as your SOP contains the new requirements of this rule, you should get there. But the key is going to be, does your SSOPs and your SOPs address the new requirements of the Sanitary Transport Rule? There are specific requirements, very nuanced specific requirements with respect to this rule about training, about cleaning, about if you are a carrier, for example, back to the last question that Jennifer addressed, that carrier needs to give back to a shipper the previous 6 cargoes and the intervening cleaning procedures that they gave. You know, how do you do that? Does your SOPs give you those how-tos? You have to demonstrate to shippers and receivers, if you are a carrier, for example, that you've maintained temperatures. How do you do that? For example, Barbara had mentioned that they partner with a company that has temperature probes. Do you have that? Like, is that your how-to? Is that your mechanism to prove it, to prove it to somebody? So you've got to go through the rule and almost make a checklist of what are all the requirements in the rule, and then lay it next to your SOPs and ask yourself, does my SOP contain all of this? If the answer is yes, then you're in great stead. If the answer is no, then your SOP needs to be enhanced and revised to be able to say you're good to go. Otherwise, yeah, then there is more to it than that by way of documentation requirements.
Okay. Jennifer, Jim is asking, how about open loads of produce shipped from a field or wholesaler to the final buyer? Will those now have to be covered or refrigerated trucks?
As Melanie mentioned kind of briefly, and I neglected to mention when I was talking about who was covered and who was not, shipments from a farm are not covered. Shipments from a wholesaler would be covered. So in some cases you may have different coverages for the same type of product depending on who is shipping that product. So when we're talking about produce and coming from a wholesaler, unless that produce is fully packaged and does not require temperature control, then that definitely would be covered under this rule. One thing that I want to point out as we're talking about the requirements and the expectations, so as hopefully not to scare people too much, although the coverage is big and broad, as I had mentioned, FDA expects that most people are already doing these things, and part of that is reflected in their economic impact analysis, understanding for these new requirements how much would it cost industry to implement them. And compared to other rules, the economic consequence of this one is estimated by FDA to be extraordinarily low. After the first year, in which you have to get those trainings in place, make sure that you have your procedures written, I think that the fee per facility FDA estimates at less than $2,000. And then after that, the estimate, and this is something you can comment on if you think it's going to cost more, is about $1 a day. So FDA is not seeing these requirements to be terribly above and beyond what's already in place today. So I just wanted to point that out, that I think it's still critically important to understand the nuances of the rule to make sure that you are doing what the rule is asking for. But FDA at least has tried to construct this rule in a way that it really just puts a regulatory cap on what people are, generally speaking, already doing.
Okay. We amazingly still have a ton of questions. I think we probably have time for just about one more, which I'll get to in a minute. I think that what we can tell everybody is that we will definitely add another topic on this, maybe as we, maybe after the comment period and we know a little bit more. But again, thank you everybody, and let's get to one more question. Melanie from Nizar, Are there different rules for shipping animal food than human food, or is this just across the board?
This rule will apply to both animal food and human food.
Okay, and there won't be differences. One will just go for the other in whatever the final rule looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, well, folks, thank you so much for this lively Q&A. We will, like I said, we'll address this topic again. If you have a burning question that just didn't get answered, feel free to send them to me at blevin, B-L-E-V-I-N, at SafetyChain.com. We'll try to get some answers back to you. And with that, Jennifer, Melanie, as always, really lively and informative session. Thank you so much.